In my remarks now, I'd like to offer a few reflections about the purpose of education. It's my hope that this will be illuminating and helpful and even a little entertaining, not only for Kirsten, to evaluate where she is at this point in her life, but for all of us. After all, you know what Mortimer Adler said about age and education. He said, and I quote, "In my judgment, 60 is the age at which one can begin to become generally educated, on condition, of course, that the process has been continuing after all formal schooling has been finished. It is a lifelong process. It is an unending pursuit." I'd like to begin with a word of wisdom from G.K. Chesterton, the eminently quotable pundit, who said, "Without education, we are in a horrible and deadly danger of taking educated people seriously." C.S. Lewis agreed. Lewis said that education provides a bigger and therefore a truer perspective or frame of reference from which to evaluate people and philosophies and issues and ideologies. The word educate means from the Latin ex, out of, ducere, to lead. The idea is to lead out of darkness and ignorance into truth and light. A crude example. You see a boy throwing stones at somebody. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it depends on the context, doesn't it? What's the frame of reference? Is it before Muslim teenagers who stormed into a church in France last weekend in Corcazon and began throwing stones at 150 parishioners, most of which were elderly and women? Or is it David with his slingshot facing Goliath? Context, frame of reference, education. Another example. How should we evaluate what's going on now in Israel? Doesn't it make a rather significant difference to know that Israel became a nation with Jerusalem as its capital 3,300 years ago, 2,000 years before the rise of Islam? And that, unlike Israel, Islam's never created a free society as we know it anywhere in the world. Nor is there anything like the freedom of Israel in the Middle East today. Nani Darwish was raised as a Muslim in Egypt. If you're interested in that particular topic, I just finished her powerful autobiography entitled, "Now They Call Me Infidel, Why I Renounced Jihad." Nani Darwish, D-A-R-W-I-S-H. Now let's consider three examples even closer to home. How can a classic education help us to evaluate our own culture? A culture which is today dominated by materialism, relativism, and narcissism. Example one. We live in a materialistic age, which is saturated with what's sometimes called scientific reductionism. The efforts being made to account for everything, including the human mind and soul, in terms of natural physical processes. Richard Dawkins, the scientist from Oxford University, arguably, certainly, today's most prolific and famous atheist, has stated that, and I quote, "Life has no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference based on this materialistic view of the world." He argues that there's no more evidence for belief in God than for Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. He says that faith heads who believe in God are ignorant, stupid, or insane. In his book, The God Illusion, he claims to prove that religion is a vice based upon indoctrination. Well, it so happens that Dawkins' view of the world is not so different from that of Lucretius, who lived 2,000 years ago. Lucretius was a poet who lost his mind after drinking a love potion spiked with poison. He developed a skeptical and materialistic view of the world in what's now a very famous poem called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. Like Dawkins, Lucretius attempted to show without any divine intervention. Now, I don't know what Mr. Dawkins has been drinking, but I do know that silly ideas are much easier to identify with this bigger historical frame of reference. It's also a fact that he commits a dozen logical fallacies in that one book, The God Delusion. A student trained in ancient literature and logic is able to make these connections and to evaluate Dawkins' assertions with historical and logical objectivity. How many students today are receiving that kind of education? However many it is, it's not a fact. Case in point, a Christian young man in Watertown, New York, by the name of Jesse Kilgore. In the fall of 2008, a biology professor at his community college challenged him to read Dawkins' God Delusion. Jesse was so overwhelmed by the book that he lost his faith. He told his closest friends that he no longer believed in God, and he had been a devout Christian, nor did he believe in anything else. Shortly after finishing the book, he killed himself. Atheism has been around a long time. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Psalm 14:1, Psalm 53:1, circa 1000 BC, 3,000 years ago. They refuse to acknowledge God, St. Paul, Romans 1, circa 50 AD. The distinctive thing about they're called the new atheists, because they've got this attitude, arrogant, strident, spiteful. The two basic principles of these new atheists seems to be, number one, there is no God. Number two, I really hate him. As Queen Gertrude says to Hamlet, the lady doth protest too much, methinks. I don't believe in Thor or Zeus or Shiva or Allah, but I'm not angry about it. It doesn't prompt any emotion except some sadness for those who are caught up in false beliefs. Certainly no anger against them. Dawkins' emotions reveals a self-contradiction. If someone tells you that life has no meaning, here's a good response. What? Life has no meaning? Do you really mean that? Meaning? There's no meaning. Example number 2. We live in a rootless, relativistic age. The concepts of sin and divine judgment and eternal truth have almost completely disappeared. I remember a fascinating lecture by the late Edward Manfield, professor at Harvard University, back in the 1980s. He said that modern man is characterized by anomie, A-N-O-M-I-E, a French word from the Greek roots meaning lawlessness. He went on to describe what he meant as rootlessness. The rootlessness of a society which has, by and large, rejected tradition, rejected the lessons of history, rejected the wisdom of the past, rejected moral absolutes. Man now lives without a past and without a future, he said. It's every individual for himself and herself to maximize the material pleasures of the present moment. Well, it happens that relativism has been around for a long time too. At least 2,400 years. In the 5th century BC, the Greek philosopher Protagoras taught that man is the measure of all things, not God. He's widely considered, has been for a long time, the father of relativism. For Protagoras, like so many people today, the truth is not something objective and universal or unchanging. For Protagoras, truth is subjective and individualistic. What may be true for you may not be true for me, and vice versa. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Do you know how Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle responded to Protagoras? They branded his philosophy as logical nonsense. In Plato's dialogue, Socrates asserts, why did Protagoras say that man is the measure of all things? Why didn't he start off by saying pig is the measure of all things, or baboon, or any sentence